He's also an honorary associate in studies in religion at the University of Sydney. And this morning, he is talking to us despite illness, and he was speaking to us about paradise and technology, the next best thing. Over to you, Doru.
Thank you. A month or so ago, during a week... There's some noise in the background. Okay. A month or so ago, during a weekly meeting of ISCAST staff, one of my colleagues praised Johann Hari's recent book, Stolen Focus. His book promised to elucidate the factors that cause the difficulties contemporary people of developed societies, including this speaker, experience in maintaining attentiveness. For, as Hari has it, I quote, "We are becoming less rational, less intelligent, less focused." I was already aware indeed of the fact that in the last few years my capacity to focus has gradually decreased. No wonder my haste to begin reading Hari's work. It really is compelling, and I press on to see how it ends. Hari's concerns match my own. Like him, first I blamed growing older as the cause of my declining capacity for attentiveness. Then the use of information technology, including reading ebooks more than printed material. Then my monitoring several email addresses, my using Facebook and other social media platforms, etc., etc. I do not disregard any of the above as factors that impact my ability to focus. Anyway, ever since I came to realize this problem, I began to reduce my use of technology and to execute what I call my Copernican turn to nature contemplation. When finally I was able to begin reading Hari's book, a world of revelation opened to me. The situation is much more complex than I had believed. In short, together with factors such as those mentioned above, the book highlights the sustained undertaking of the tech companies to steal our attention in order to make money. An objective backdrop to my list of subjective factors. And during this conference, we shall hear more of it, I am certain. But let me get to Hari's main point. I quote, "You could design the technology not so that it pulls people away from their deeper and more meaningful goals, but so that it helps them to achieve them," end of quote. And a few pages later, quote, "After I've adjusted your perspective in this way, seeing this as a debate between whether you are pro-tech or anti-tech is bogus, and lets the people who stole your attention off the hook. The real debate is what tech, designed for what purposes, in whose interests," end of quote. And this is where I leave Hari's stolen focus behind me, not being interested in hypothesizing about the ideal tech company that nurtures the well-being of our society and my own, rather than making money at all cost. However, before moving any further, I must draw attention to a couple of things in the above excerpts. First, there is the question of whether or not we will continue to use technology. Second, a question of what really matters with pursuing meaningful good goals taking precedence over going nuts by using a technology designed to subdue human freedom and to undermine our well-being. It is with these questions that I am concerned here, even though I won't quite use Hari's terms. I begin by stating the obvious. Regardless of the extent of the problem in our day and age, where technology has taken over, transforming people in mindless consumers of obnoxious products, this story is old news. As such, it requires from us to realize yet another issue, that is, our inability to learn from past lessons, which causes us to repeat the same mistakes again and again in different settings. And in the 80s, 90s, I read a number of studies, analysis, mainly by sociologists, that pointed out the fact that insofar as modernity is an anti-traditional, anti-wisdom kind of culture and society, there's no wonder why all these things happen. Why do you keep repeating mistakes? In what follows, my aim is first to refresh our memory with wisdom from the scriptures, especially the Genesis paradise narrative, whose relevant message seems to elude us. Second, to summarize early Christian and medieval traditions that spell out the crisis of a humanity hell-bent on technological development, together with its quest for retrieving paradise, for freeing itself from the obsession of tool-making. And third, to sketch in the light of traditional wisdom what seems to be a healthy way of using this next best thing, technology, without abandoning our paradisal or meaningful aspirations. Turning to the first item, as I see it, the beginning of the scripturally recorded story of God's people communicates a wisdom lesson about humanity's existential shift from the paradisal life of freedom and glory in God's presence to a life of material needs and tool-making away from God's presence. This shift amounts to humanity renouncing the calling to ascend from glory to glory, as we read in 2 Corinthians 3:18, in order to experience the hardships of survival. Impressive and tragic, this shift is entwined with suffering and failure. As early Christian interpreters, such as Ephraim the Syrian and John Chrysostom, showed in the 4th century, the scriptural language of reward and punishment of Genesis 2 and 3 is pedagogical, aimed at immature minds that cannot discern what is good and what is wrong. In Ephraim's words, Moses wrote about the true commandments that had become forgotten, while adding those that were necessary for the infantile state of the people. In other words, he brings to our attention the fact that when we read Genesis or other scriptures that are addressed to less spiritual advanced people, we need to be mindful of how we read. To this, John Chrysostom adds, quote, "When Moses in the beginning took on the instruction of the human race, he taught his listeners the elements, the fundamentals, whereas Paul and John, taking over from Moses, could at that later stage transmit more developed notions." End of quote. The passages are from Ephraim's commentary on Genesis, the prologue, section 4, and John Chrysostom's homilies on Genesis, the second homily, section 9. So understood, the paradise narrative in Genesis 2 and 3 teaches a wisdom lesson, specifically whatever befalls humanity when, instead of heeding the divine guidance that promises good outcomes, chooses its own path, which leads to defeat. Several elements in the story herald this existential shift, or the existential shift mentioned earlier. The irony of the opened eyes in Genesis 3:7 denotes absence of spiritual insight, while the metaphor of the garments of skin in 3:21 marks an existence reduced to biology, deprived of glory, which anticipates God's verdict, "They are flesh," in Genesis 6:3. Closer to my purposes, humankind's defeat transpires through the necessity of strenuous effort and ingenuity for survival on earth. "In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life," we read in 3:17. And, "by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground," 3:19. This might not sound so bad, as the hope of survival remains there. But survival within one's own means does not promise a return to the tree of life and the garments of glory. You will return to the ground. This to me signifies defeat. Meanwhile, however, before it tastes the bitterness of utter failure, humanity cultivates the next best thing to a paradisal cornucopia. It devises means of survival, building settlements, even cities, and inventing technology and the arts. We read about this in the lead up to the flood narrative from Genesis 4:17 to the end of chapter 5, and then again in Genesis 11, the first 9 verses, the story of the tower. The latter, contemporary exegetes tell us, is the actual end of the paradise narrative, signifying the nadir, namely the lowest point of humanity's new existential mode, again ironically under the guise of the attempt of erecting a mighty tower. In other words, the story of the tower marks the radical shift from paradisal spirituality to the technological society familiar to us. Now, as most believers do, we could take this complex lesson as it reads, or we can consider it, as I prefer, through the eyes of the early Christian tradition of interpretation, which amounts to a rabbit hole leading to Wonderland. Let me give you a classical example. Basil of Caesarea, another 4th century author, saw the opening line of Genesis as a, quote, statement by anticipation of the dogmas regarding the world's consummation and transformation. End of quote. This is from his homilies on the Hexaemeron, the first homily, section 3. In plain English, this is to say that the story of beginnings is a prophecy about creation's end, something Basil might have inferred from reading the scriptures as a whole. Thus, Genesis in the light of Revelation 21 and 22. He was neither the first nor the last early Christian author to do so. But what matters here is that from this vantage point of a teleological metaphor, namely reading the past from the end of history, the paradise narrative does no longer signify a literal shift from the spiritual life to the technological civilization. Instead, it conveys a wisdom lesson meant to be learned and pondered through the centuries so that God's people can avoid prioritizing what leads to humanity's ruin. And so, we don't need to prove the historicity of the events. We must learn wisdom. Regardless of where we locate the beginning of humanity in the pre-paradisal dust of the earth of Genesis 2:7, which means biology, or in the paradisal blessing of Genesis 2:8, which marks the beginning of God's people, therefore a spiritual remaking of humankind, we have to factor in as much hard evidence as we can. After all, as the same Basil of Caesarea has it, I quote, when he, namely Moses, said, "In the beginning God made the heaven and the earth," he passed over in silence many things, such as water, air, and fire, out of which created beings happen to be produced. All these elements that completed the cosmos obviously existed beyond any doubt, but the story left them out so that our mind can exercise its skills by inferring the rest from little pointers. This is from the second homily on the Hexaemeron, section 3. And I'd like to point out the fact that what he says here is fundamental for, let's call it, a Christian know-how when it comes to engaging science, or what we would call today a scientifically engaged theology, scripturally based. The scriptures, of course, do not offer all the details of the history of creation, but the sciences might offer us glimpses that are useful sometimes, the way, for example, Basil's ancient physics of the 4 elements, water, air, fire, and so on, helped him make sense of certain blank spots on the map, so to speak. Now, Scripture is not a scientific textbook. This is what we understand from Basil's position. It gives us pointers, wisdom, lessons, as I keep saying, and we must fill the gaps with facts. And the hard evidence tells us that not only our species, Homo sapiens, double sapiens, very smart that is, was from very early able to make tools and use them for its survival. Our Neanderthal cousins did so too. And long before our own archaic predecessors and corresponding to their achievements, Neanderthals wedded technology and spirituality within what recent studies call a symbolic material culture. There is no room here for an initially ethereal condition from which humankind has fallen into the garments of skin of biology and technology. I beg to differ, therefore, from the classical view of Gregory the Theologian and Maximus the Confessor, who, in the 4th and the 7th century respectively, seem to have believed that the paradise, whatever that might have been, as Gregory says, on the one hand entailed non-technological life, and on the other hand, preceded humankind's dependence on tools in a chronological sense. That's Gregory's oration on Pascha, Easter, section 8, and Maximus's Difficulty 45, section 5. The paleontological and archeological evidence available to us can be tweaked to support, in turn, the more complex story of a pocket of humanity advancing from dust of the earth to the glory of paradise, to then return to the garments of skin of mere biology and tool making. And this seems to be a recurrent experience, at least when we consider the spiritual feat of many groups, Christian and otherwise, ascetic and otherwise, that throughout history have been renouncing technology in order to pursue what Honorary calls deeper and more meaningful goals. For example, the early monastic literature of Egypt and Palestine, so roughly 4th, 5th century, mentions deliberate quests for paradise, monks and nuns going into the desert seeking the lost garden, sometimes resulting in strict vegan diets, secured by way of gathering from, not cultivating the land. So, not hunter-gatherers, only gatherers. One thing is clear. Humanity's past is full of ups and downs, by which I mean phases of paradisal life, free of tools, and technological achievement, development, the next best thing, where it depends on tools for surviving and thriving. In fact, parallel strands of experience continue to this day in the form of either-or choices between technology and spirituality, and the examples are too many to mention here. Other questions linger, though. If it is not so much a matter of alternating paradigms, with technology and the spiritual life either attempting to cancel each other or remaining indifferent to one another, do we have another option? Could we, in Honorary's words, design the technology not so that it pulls people away from their deeper and more meaningful goals, but so that it helps them to achieve them? And, I would add, would devising a different technology suffice to that end? And again, what kind of tower should we build to bring back my lost focus? The wisdom lessons addressed above seem to point elsewhere, with spirituality featuring prominently. Of course, it's not a matter of becoming anti-tech. It's about establishing a different kind of relation between the spiritual life and technology. After all, as we read in Genesis 2:15, in God's presence, people are encouraged to work the land, to till it and keep it, which might include tools. My above questions, therefore, boil down to another point. could paradise and technology do more than exist in parallel universes? Could they creatively interact towards fostering the self's well-being and a better world? Said otherwise, and taking my cue from the researchers involved in the Theology of Work project at the Seattle Pacific University in 2013, could we work in God's image as God would? I would respond in the affirmative, and I would do so given another lesson from Maximus the Confessor, which I presented at the previous COSAC in 2020. And there's a published version of that paper, an article, Strange Bedfellows, Orthodox Perspectives on Theology, Spirituality, Science and Technology, published somewhere in Romania, in a Romanian journal, but in English, 2020, at the end of the year. Here are the relevant highlights of Maximus's solution. Attempting to bridge the paradise and the inhabited world, the spiritual life and technology, Maximus, it seems to me, suggests that people could live spiritually within a technological society. The spiritual criterion determining how tools are to be used in order to help us grow and flourish beyond mere survival, and without detracting us from deeper and more meaningful goals. Working on ourselves, opening up to God in prayer, practicing attentiveness and contemplation, as well as pursuing the virtues, leads to more than personal progress. Taking the spiritual path can change both us and the tools we use. This solution, which Maximus's thinking has inspired, translates yet another scriptural metaphor of the urban and technological rhythms transfigured under the guise of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. In that light, the next best thing, namely the city culture and the technological society of Genesis 4:17 and today, appear to be potentially redeemable. And this is where I leave it.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't know, Doru, if you heard the applause that was in the room. There was
I did. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm always excited when someone describes patristic exegesis as a rabbit hole into Wonderland. What a great description. We have a couple of moments for questions before our next speaker, and I've got one online already, a couple online, but if you want to log on to Slido, slido.com, and put in stream one, you can pop in questions. And we have a question from Mark, who asks Doru, I believe that the thing that makes us human is intent. Is technology destroying our practice of intent and a loss of wisdom? What do you think?
Wow. Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. It's great. Well, yeah, we are the product of our will, the product of our experiences, and so on and so forth. You know, we embodied a lot of stuff in a lifetime. Well, what I try to say here is that perhaps we can indeed think of a technology that is less intrusive, a technology that doesn't replace us so much the way it does, and keeps us working. And this is from this viewpoint, it's so important for us to cultivate our potential, intellect, affectivity, will, free choice, and so on and so forth, in order to learn better ways of handling the situation, including our dependence on tools, and so to pursue a more meaningful life.
I hope that was satisfactory, Mark. We have another question now from Slido, which is to ask Doru, does not the command to work the ground in Genesis 2 verse 15 suggest tool use, and so at least some technology? Your thoughts? Yeah,
maybe the question was written before I got to that point. I said, yes, at the end of my paper that indeed, in that light, we are supposed to think of God-imaged, if you like, way of working. And the project I mentioned there, explores a lot of possibilities to that end. Yeah, so of course, it's not a matter of disparaging technology, it's a matter of learning how to use it in a God-befitting way, wisely that is.
Thanks, Doru. We've got one last question that's come through. Oh, two. What about Babel? Question mark. It was very broad, very open.
What about what? Sorry?
What about Babel?
Ah, Babel. Yeah. Well, I mentioned the story of the tower. For me, that's the most beautiful irony and the most blatant irony in the whole of Scripture, where our glory, embodied in the idea of building a tower, collapses to ruin. And this is, for me, a metaphor of our entire history of tool making.
Great. Another question. I'm interested in the idea that clothing in Genesis reduces us to biology and flesh. Some now say clothing is what makes us human. We use our bodies as a medium. What do you think, Daryl?
Well, these are interesting things, of course. And as I pointed out earlier, I tend to read the scriptures, including Genesis, or foremost Genesis, through the lens of a very lengthy and complex tradition of interpretation, especially from the early Christian centuries. And for example, I would invite the questioner to look at the hymns of Paradise by Ephraim the Syrian, a beautiful poetic exegesis of Genesis 2 and 3, where there's this zigzag between the garments of skin and the garments of glory. So it's not only the body, it's not the biology. There are states, existential states that humanity can put on, so to speak, as though clothing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doru. Thank you for your stimulating talk. If you can give him a round of applause. Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I'll